Hi, my name is Jeremy Cox, and I'm going to be showing you a workflow technique that I've been working on for the last month or so. I've been working on a very intense 3D job at work that involves both a lot of heavy compositing of 3D renders, as well as a lot of integrating 2D planes and 2D cards into these 3D renders in After Effects. So I developed this technique that can be used to aid in that process and to really help you visualize what your 3D scene looks like in After Effects where you're compositing these 2D elements. So just an example here is this is just a little scene I threw together a little while ago. It's thinking particles. There's just a bunch of interaction, and it's just stuff going on. So if I render it, it looks like this. And just so you can see what we're going to be doing with it, if I jump into After Effects, you can see here's a full 3D representation of a frame of that animation in After Effects. Now, I'm using trapcode form to do this, so you'll need that. I am using Cinema 4D. You should be able to do this in any 3D application, although Cinema 4D is what I use and it's what I created, a little preset that I'm providing for you. And I also created a script for After Effects. There should be a link below here if you're watching this in Vimeo. If you're not watching in Vimeo, go to the Vimeo page and there should be a link down there that you can download the Cinema 4D preset and the After Effects script. But let's go in, and first I'll show you how you set this up in Cinema 4D to achieve something like this. So first thing is I'm going to load in the preset that I'm going to provide you with, which is just this point position shader. Now I'm going to be using, I've created a shader that's similar to a point position or XYZ, or I've heard it called many different things, but essentially it's a shader where every pixel of your image is given an RGB value that corresponds to the XYZ position of that pixel. Now, every color has 3 channels in it, a red, a green, and a blue. This is really handy because every 3D coordinate needs 3 values to position it. It needs an X, Y, and a Z. So we can literally correspond one value of color to one axis position. So that's the general idea of what I'm doing. It's a little different than how it's normally been done, just because I'm using trapcode form, which doesn't do things quite the same way, and I want it to work in 16-bit or 8-bit for that matter in After Effects as opposed to 32-bit floating point, which is what normally point position passes are. So I've loaded in the scene. I'm going to assume that you've already rendered your color pass and it looks beautiful, and you already have a 3D camera that can be imported into After Effects. So what I'm going to do is I need to actually replace or override all of the materials on these objects with this material. Now, that's not a particularly elegant solution. If any of you out there are programmers or know how to write plugins for Cinema 4D, I'd love to hear from you, and maybe we can make either a post effect or a multipass shader or something that can do this that won't actually involve needing to create all these copies of this shader, but for now this is how you do it. So I'm literally just going to take it, try and find all of my materials, and put a copy of this on top. Now if any of you use Render Elements, which is an excellent plugin for Cinema 4D, you can automate some of this where you can very easily switch back and forth between using different materials and turn off and on cameras and easily render different passes, much like in Maya or other 3D applications. You have the idea of render layers. So that would be an easy way to automate switching back and forth between some of these things. So I've applied all of the shader to all of my objects. You can see it didn't apply to some, but that's just because this is thinking particles, and after a particle has been spawned, sometimes it doesn't want to take a new material, so all we need to do is rerun the sim, and you can see it's applying to all my materials. When I render it, you can see it looks very flat. Now there is a little bit of a gradation here, but every single pixel is actually a unique color, and it is corresponding to its position in 3D space. Now the one thing that we don't want is anti-aliasing. You can see how we have very smooth edges, which is great for a normal render, but for a render like this where we're just looking for the data that's in each pixel essentially, we want each pixel to be precise rather than an average of a bunch of pixels. So for example, these edges go from a very light gray to a very dark gray to black. Now those grays will actually be seen as those pixels being in some position in space that is not right here. So it's important that you go into your render settings and set anti-aliasing to none. And you see there we get a jagged version, but it's better. So now that we've gotten it applied, there's actually one other thing we need to do. If we look at our scene from above, or from any of the views for that matter, you can see we have a red box around it. Now this is the controller of this, this preset material that I have. The idea is that the gradation within the material actually goes from one edge of the box to the other in all three axes. So it is important both that the box contain our entire scene, but also there's no reason to have it be any larger than it needs to be. So I'm just going to scale it down until it more than encompasses our scene, but is enough that I think that's a pretty good amount. And you can see our scale here is 300. Now it's very important that you remember that because we're going to be using it later. I also have snapping settings here, so you can actually snap to the nearest 50, 100, 1,000, 1, whatever you want, just so that it's a rounder number, so you don't need to remember some very arbitrary weird number that doesn't make any sense. So at least it's a round number that's makes some sense. You can see it actually says in here it's 300. Now if I render it again, you can see the colors should be a little more saturated and you should see a little more gradation across the image. So I think with that we're ready to render this. Again, I'm assuming that you've rendered the color pass and you've rendered other things already. So I'm just going to save it. That looks good. I'm going to save it as an OpenEXR. I like EXRs. You can do TIFFs. You can do any image sequence that can do at least 16 bits. The one thing to keep in mind about using TIFFs or any other non-EXR is that they usually default to sRGB, and you want to make sure that it's set to linear. And that at least 16-bit, you can do 32 bits, but 16 bits fine. But I like just doing EXRs because it automatically sets that for me and I don't forget to do it, so it's there. I've already saved out my compositing project file, so I don't need to save that again. I'm going to hit render. I think I actually set this too large. I think it's still set to 1920, 1080. Yes, for this preview I'm just going to do 960 by 40. That should be plenty large and it should render faster. There we go. It's flying through much, much faster. So I'm going to go back into After Effects. I'm going to delete what I did here just so we can start from scratch and show you how to do this. So I'm going to start out by bringing in my AEC file, which I believe is this one, which will have my camera, and it should bring in my color pass as well. Yep, so there's my color pass and camera already in a comp. It's set to the full length of my project. I don't really need that, I just need it set to the length that I rendered, which was just enough for this preview. I set up my gamma a little bit, just so you can see what's going on. It doesn't get lost on Vimeo. So we've got our animation. Our point pass should be done. So I'm just going to, I did a lot of test renders, so there's a bunch of stuff in here, but this should be the one that we just rendered. So we've got our EXR point position pass here. One important thing that you need to do is go into your color management and set preserve RGB. Now it's a little weird because both in Cinema 4D you needed to set it as linear, and then here you need to set it to preserve RGB to get it to behave correctly, but for some reason you can't just render with gamma baked in and then not check preserve or whatever. For some reason this is just what I have found you need to do. Just how Form likes it. So we have our point position pass. I'm going to drag that in here as well. Now, because our gamma is really high, you can see it's white, looking white, but if I go back to normal, those are the colors that we want it to look like. So what I'm going to do is create a new solid. I'm going to go to trapcode form. And there are a few basic settings I need to set initially. It's mostly zeroing things out, just because we want our displacement using this color image to be controlling it, not a bunch of other values. So for example, our size should all be 0, just because we don't want it to have any initial size I'm going to set our initial particles in x and y to be our image dimensions. There's only one particle in z. I'm going to zero out the center, just because in 3D applications the center is 0, 0, 0, not the center of After Effects, which it likes to put as the halfway between the right and bottom, which is half the comp size. So those are the major settings I'm going to change. Then I just need to tell it to use these channels for the displacement and the color. So under displacement, I'm going to do map over XY. RGB to XYZ is exactly what we want. And then I'm just going to set it to our point position layer as displacement. Now, if I hide these, you can see we've actually got something there, and it's in 3D space. Unfortunately, it's too small. Now this is because this strength actually corresponds to that number I told you to remember earlier, which I assume you remember was 300. So you can see once I set it to 300, it actually is going to match exactly, well, almost. I think there was a difference in calculation in one of my particles for some reason, so that particle is actually off for some reason, but it'll be good enough for this example. So one other thing I want to do is set color and alpha. I want to just set my layer to be my color layer. Functionality can be either RGB or RGBA, and map over XY. You can see now it's colored. The one other thing I want to do is, you can see how it's getting really blown out. That's partially the setting I have here, just so you can see it a little better, because they're kind of thin lines. But it's also, the transfer mode here is set to add. I just set to normal. Those are more accurate to my original colors, so it's not combining pixels when they overlap. So you can see, if I scrub through, we're seeing our original animation, but in particles. Now that's not all that interesting. It just looks exactly the same as our render, but some of the edges aren't quite as nice. Now, what I can do, not create a new null object, I actually want to create a camera. You can see again our 0 point is up there, so that's where it thinks it is. Now you can see I'm actually navigating around this in 3 dimensions. Now you can see it's getting a little bit slow. It's taking a while to catch up. There are a couple settings we can do to make that faster. As I said, I'm using this mostly as an aid to help in my compositing, so I'm not actually rendering this out as an element. That's not to say that there aren't some very interesting uses you could have for doing something like this. It's somewhat similar to the what your opcode form has now, which is the using an OBJ to put particles on all its vertices, except that in this case you are not limited to needing to export or to have something that can be exported as an OBJ. For example, these particles would not work well as an OBJ export. It's hard to sort of knowing to bake thinking particles. I'm not even sure it's possible, to be honest. And you also you have significantly denser mesh of particles than you would realistically be able to do using an OBJ sequence. The downside, of course, is that if we go to the backside, there's nothing there. We can only have particles where the camera can see. You could put a second camera in the back and render that, and do a second form element, and you could create all sorts of neat holographic effects. I think there are all sorts of interesting creative possibilities for this, but I'm just saying that I'm mostly using it in a different way that I will show you in a moment. But as I said, there's some ways you could speed this up. If we go down here to rendering in form, you can set to motion preview. That will speed things up quite a bit. The other thing that will really speed it up is just reducing the number of particles you have. So one handy thing you can do in After Effects is you can actually do math in this box. So I can just divide by 2. Divide by 2. You can see it's much more responsive now. I'm actually really able to see it in real time as I'm orbiting around this. And of course I can zoom in, I can do whatever I want in 3D space because they're just a bunch of particles. Now, of course, because they're particles and this is form, you can do anything else you could do in form. You could apply fractal. You could, let's try doing a disperse. And then we twist the whole thing. You can animate this, of course. You can animate any of these values. So I could, see it's already looking crazy. And of course, it's my original animation is still there, so it's going to do this crazy effect as it travels through this spiral. Now, this just, I don't know about you, but this kind of blows my mind that you can do this in After Effects. I think it's amazing. And again, I'm only in motion preview mode here. If I change it back to full render, and even if I go up and multiply these by 2 just to get back to original number of particles, look at that amazing sort of nebula universe thing we created. So I really hope that some of you take some of these ideas and really do crazy things. I'd love to see what you guys can do with this. Isn't that cool? Now, as I said, I've actually created a script that automates some of this stuff for you. Now, I'm just going to delete everything except my original camera to demonstrate this for you. And then I'm going to bring back in the color and point position. Now, if you've downloaded the script and installed it correctly, you should see here in Window, Point Cloud, you should be able to launch the script. I'm not going to go through how you install scripts for the UI and all that, but if you Google it, I'm sure you can find it. So here we have our position shader scale, create point cloud, and then create point position null. Now this button is pretty cool. I'm going to show it to you later, but for now, let's just talk about the create point cloud. So again, remember I set it to 300 in Cinema 4D. You can set that to 300. Now I'm going to select the 2 layers that I want to use as the displacement, or the point position pass, and the color pass. So first you select the point position pass, and then I'm going to hold down Command and select the color pass. Now the order in which you select it is important. It always assumes that your first selection is the point pass, XYZ pass, and the second selection is the color pass. So all you need to do is hit Create Point Cloud, and there you go. I instantly did that work that took a couple minutes to initially set up in 1 click. So again, you can just scrub through. Very nice and fast. Do a new camera. Get up here in the right area. Orbit around a little bit. Perfect. Now, because this is a script, I was able to actually build in a couple other features that it applies to this solid that also has form on it. So if we go into our effects, you can see there's form renamed as point cloud. But I've also got a cloud resolution. Now this does the same thing as what I was doing, the little math I was doing in the particles in X and particles in Y dialog. So I can just set this to 1, which will mean that it's doing every single pixel. Every single pixel in the original image is going to be 1 pixel in the point cloud. If I do 2, it's the same as if I was dividing by 2, so it's every other pixel. If I do 4, it's going to be every 4. So once you get down to 4, it's really, really fast. That's nice. Very interactive. But it's just a quick way to switch your resolution up and down. If you incorrectly set your shader scale initially, you can scale up or down the whole thing here. But in order to get it to match the original camera, you're going to want to keep that at whatever you originally set it at. But say you re-render a pass and you needed to change the scale, but you don't have to reset this up, you can just change that to whatever the new scale is in your new render. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this create point position null. Now, what this does is, this is really about being able to very precisely place your 2D cards or 2D elements on planes into this 3D scene. So just as an example of that, I'm going to create a solid. I'm going to make it 3D. I'm going to scale it down a bit. And let's actually put a shape on it. We can do a star. Just so we can see it. So what I'm going to do is hit create point position null. Just make sure that your shader scale is still set the same because it's still using this number. When I do this, you can see it just created a parent null to that original solid, and it applied a couple sliders and effects to this. One is a color selector. Now this color, this is actually the color that corresponds to the point that is in. So if you remember that every pixel has a corresponding color given its XYZ coordinates, this color is this point's XYZ coordinates. So what that means is I can actually use the color picker to select a color on here to position it. So for example, if I open up this pass in a second window, and go to my null, and say I want it stuck right to the middle of this. Bam! It's stuck in 3D space to that very point. Say I want it stuck to that. Again, I can just select the color, and it is stuck exactly at that point. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this is a point at all time. Well, that was a bad way of saying it. It does not know when an object is moving. So right now I stuck it, I didn't stick it to, but I stuck it to the same position as this object right here. Now, as we cycle through, you can see it's moving through space. But of course, this has no way of knowing that. It just knows that the color it should be at is this. So as of right now, there is no way for it to automatically track with something. We could keyframe this. So say you select right there, keyframe the color at that point, go to a later frame, go to there. You can see now it's moving more or less with that. Of course, it's not precise because it's just interpolating between those two keyframes. But as a rough method of tracking something in 3D space, you could do it this way. I don't necessarily recommend it for precise things, but it can get you partway there. But really, the advantage is being able to place these 3D objects into your 3D scene using this color pass. The other way you can do this, and I'm just going to clear this up a little bit and just start over just so we can see what I'm doing. Again, I'm going to select those two. It's actually not true. I'm only going to select the point position. Before I selected both of them, and that meant that it used the first one you selected as the point position and the second one as the color. In this case, if you only select one, it will actually use both, or you'll use the point position as both the color and the displacement. So what that allows us to do is use, especially if I lower this to a low resolution where it starts to fill in nice and solid, you can actually use this pass and move around it in 3D and actually reference that color that's on this pass. So again, it's blown out because I have this gamma turned up. I'll turn it down a little bit. But so I created that. Let's create another camera just so we can look around it. You can see I'm looking from the side. Let's do solid again. Make it smaller. Make it 3D. Create point position null. Select a color, and it's there. And it's there. And it's there. And when we go back to our original camera, you can see it's exactly on that object. Now, I chose this example just because it was sort of flashy and interesting to see. It's not, of course, an example that you would need a lot of compositing with, presumably, but the way I see this being useful is more like a shot like this. Now, I won't go through it completely. I'll just kind of talk a little bit about it and how it could be used. But you can see this is a matte painting